It's hard to succeed with the oft-derided second sequel. To make one great film is a tall task unto itself, never mind making two great films. But to make a third entry for a trilogy that not only caps things off in a meaningful way, but stands tall next to the first two is almost a miracle of filmmaking. When your trilogy, in turn, is also part of an even larger cinematic saga, one with Best Picture pedigree to boot, you've got some mighty big shoes to fill. Enter Creed. I love the first Creed film. I love the first Creed film. As iconic and endearing as Rocky Balboa is, the tale of Adonis Creed is the one which resonates the most with me. I will never forget what it was like to see Michael B. Jordan take over the reins of the franchise with such confidence, to see Adonis team up with Rocky in order to honor his father's legacy, but also rise above it. And it remains one of my favorite movies ever. And you know what? Creed 2 is almost as magnificent. It's a film that's juggling a lot of moving pieces at once as it expands the Creed lore while also bringing closure to a piece of Rocky's story that felt incomplete. But it's a really impressive film because of its ambitions, and it's a more than worthy sequel as a result. I mean, if you can make the Cold War propaganda piece that is Rocky IV even more emotional and genuine in Creed 2, I don't know what they were able to do with the Dragos in that film and tie it into Adonis and the Apollo and Rocky stuff. It shouldn't work. It shouldn't work at all. Rocky IV is ridiculous, but they managed to do it. So with Creed 3 finally here, with Michael B. Jordan sitting in the director's chair for the first time ever to deliver a long-anticipated follow-up to the first two movies, did this entry defy the second sequel curse and manage to go the distance? Well, yes. And no, but mostly yes. Jordan's direction is on point, man, and Adonis Creed has met one hell of a match with Jonathan Majors' franchise-defining antagonist. That being said, I think the film stretches the storytelling potential of the Creed films to its absolute limit. It packs a mean punch, but it's got some stamina issues. Right off the bat, Jonathan Majors killed it, slayed, unreal. The dude, we've been blessed with his presence, and I love him. He's incredible. Damian Anderson is arguably the best Rocky villain, no holds barred. Every other Rocky villain, Apollo, Drago, Ricky Conlon, start off antagonistic to Rocky and or Adonis, being outwardly hostile in a way that gives you little to endear yourself to them. For most of them, you finally get to see their deeper humanity at the end of the final fight, although even then sometimes it takes multiple films. I mean, look at Drago. Creed 3 does a complete 180 on the typical portrayal of an antagonist, and it's actually interesting because Dame, given the circumstances and the life he's lived, is similar to someone like Rocky, and especially with him trying to rise through the ranks and prove himself and defeat the champ, that feels more like the journey we went on with Sylvester Stallone years ago. And in this film, Adonis feels more like Apollo when we meet him in that first Rocky film. So the way that Jordan has flipped the POV here, where we're now seeing Adonis as an Apollo-like figure, and we're seeing what he has to go up against with an unorthodox fighter like Dame, who's, again, similar to Rocky, that makes for an interesting dynamic, especially because for half of the film, you sympathize with Dame. You feel badly for his circumstances, and you want to see him finally get his chance to be the best. You believe that he's here for a fresh start, and because of how hard he's literally fought to get back to where he is, you're happy when he gets his shot. And then you find out he's been manipulating Adonis the entire time, and it makes you rail against him. But then you're not completely against him because of the circumstances that forged him into the person he is. Delphi says that Dame is telling Adonis and us who he is, and we should believe him. But that isn't who Dame is. It's not the complete picture of him, at least. And Jonathan Majors, even in Dame's most despicable moments, such as when he sucker punches Adonis on the beach, is always letting Dame's underlying chip on his shoulder poke through to the surface. He's a deeply damaged individual because of what he went through, because of his time in prison, and he doesn't know what else to do other than seek his glory through a vengeful path, other than to pursue the dream he held on to that got him through the tough stuff. Look, Jonathan Majors is one of the greatest actors we have working today, but his work in Creed 3 stands among some of my favorite I've seen from him. It's absolutely worthy of high praise and recognition. The film lives or dies on the back of Dame and Jonathan Majors, because Dame ultimately is the story of Creed 3. Creed 3 is a fundamentally LA story, one of generational anger and pain in the black communities of Los Angeles specifically. The film frames the fight between Adonis and Dame as the Battle of Los Angeles, referencing on a micro level their geographical roots, but on a macro level, the fact that boxing is, so often for some of the most disenfranchised, an outlet of survival. There have been decades of conflict between the black communities in LA County in particular, and have been the result of institutional neglect and even sometimes malicious, subversive efforts to degrade those communities. Adonis and Dame both experienced that, but Adonis was one of the lucky few who managed to find a way out. And in his case, it was because he just so happened to be the illegitimate child of an incredibly wealthy icon of sports. Who else is going to be able to inflate that kind of life raft for themselves? Dame was never afforded that type of opportunity, even though he was the best, quote unquote, and got almost inevitably lost between the cracks, being incarcerated as a result of a situation that was even Adonis's fault to boot. And while it's easy to side with Dame here, or to at least sympathize with his villainy, you have to factor in that Adonis also acted out of self-preservation, something that can be a default state for so many disenfranchised people in America. And he was only a kid. And even that initial act of beating up his abusive stepfather that sparked the whole conflict was born from a deep trauma that came from an unfair childhood that he never asked for. And then even that was another layer to it, of his mother's failings and his stepfather's abuse, of the questions that arise regarding how those things were fostered in their generation, in the one before, and so on. The further you go down that rabbit hole, the more you see that Adonis and Dame are two deeply sympathetic characters who were both damaged by the nature of this country and what it does to minorities. It's remarkably unflinching, and I have a lot of respect for both the script and for Michael B. Jordan's direction for committing to the commentary. It doesn't feel half-baked at all, and the most potent form of it comes at the peak of the final fight, when Adonis and Dame are both deep in their heads, and the crowd and stadium, everything outside the ring, disappears in darkness for them. The ring is shown surrounded by the bars of a jail cell. It represents a fate which both men have suffered. Adonis in juvenile detention, and Dame not only there alongside Adonis, but in jail for most of his adult life before the point, and which threatens countless others outside of that ring, people who we will never see contend for a heavyweight title and whose names we will never know. Apollo Creed fought with anger. Marianne festered her anger at his death, for him leaving her. Adonis's fighting spirit and his capacity for anger threatens to corrupt his daughter, with her having already had an incident where she dealt with a bully by knocking them out as a first resort. His first impulse is to bury his trauma instead of confronting it, and it causes issues with his relationships and family in all three Creed films. Creed 3 feels like the first time Adonis genuinely faces that reality and understands what has fueled every rift he's had with Bianca in all three movies. Violence begets violence, and the violence around Adonis is not exempt from forming such a poison. Bianca, in an earlier part of the film, even encapsulates why Adonis has thrived versus what Dame needs to do in order to pull himself out of his darkness. With the loss of her hearing, she can no longer sing her songs on stage, deciding to become a songwriter and producer for another pop star to explode. Her dreams didn't turn out like she planned, but she had to try and find a form of happiness despite that. It's not a coincidence that she talks about this with Adonis and Dame present for the conversation. That doesn't mean Dame needs to just get over it, though. He lost 18 years of his life, and in that time frame saw at least 3 different fighters claim the title he dreamed about, dedicated his life to, in addition to however many other heavyweight champions we didn't see on screen during those years. His experiences have been wrought with tragedy and oppression, and some of his scars will likely never fully heal. But he can't let that trap him in the cage that the world is trying to keep him in. But even beyond the evocative power of the imagery, the charged commentary, the final fight is the most visually arresting set piece that any of these films have ever incorporated. You can say what you want about the occasional dodgy green screen moment, but Michael B. Jordan directed the hell out of this showdown. All of the fights look fantastic. I think of Felix entering the title fight with Dame, where the entire thing is orchestrated and framed to look like an anime. I think of those cell bars surrounding the ring. I think of how both Adonis and Dame visualize the younger version of the other as they prepare to open every wound that was created all those years ago. You get a very instructive view of Jordan's tastes and influences, and it makes sense with him being a child of the 80s, and his visual style would have elements of Dragon Ball or Cowboy Bebop and countless other animes that I can't even think of sprinkled throughout. Most of all though, it works from a storytelling perspective. It all shows how Adonis has grown much more confident and capable as a fighter, and even when we see fights from Dame's perspective, his ruthlessness is highlighted, his drive to be the best at all costs. As much as I think Creed 3 should be the last film in this series, more on that later, I absolutely do not think this should be Jordan's last directorial credit. I cannot wait to see what he goes on to do as a filmmaker. There's even a great callback to the first Creed with Conlon, but it also feels like a callback to the Rocky films, with Conlon becoming Creed's Apollo, the contender he repeatedly faces off against under a veil of hostility, only to ultimately come to respect deeply. And between that and Victor Drago showing up again and being buddies with Adonis, even though they're kind of competitors, I love how there's sort of this built-up Creed verse that doesn't just rely on Rocky's presence to hold up on its own. I think that's an added benefit of having Jordan direct, because who would have a greater respect for the first 2 Creed films? That being said, one of the biggest weak links of Creed 3 is that Ludwig Göransson's scoring is deeply missed. Joseph Shirley, who I respect and he's done some amazing work before, is doing his best to move the film along musically, but he's got Ludwig's motifs from the first 2 films serving as the backbone of his work, and it doesn't feel like he does anything to move the musical landscape of the Creed verse forward. I mean, those motifs that have become iconic, like they're barely there in the movie at all. It's part of what makes it lose that Creed identity, which is weird given the nature of the story being told here. And on the one hand, this feels like the appropriate first film to not contain a full blast of Gonna Fly Now. Given that it's the first film in which Rocky doesn't appear, it's a bit of a letdown because the rest of the score is almost all kind of forgettable and one note, and by not having Gonna Fly Now or the Creed theme in there, save for the occasional couple of notes creeping into other pieces, you don't really ever get a moment where the score peaks or goes big. I don't believe that a film's score should hold your hand, but I also believe that the musical cues which accompany a film should function alongside the storytelling. For a film that is deliberately such a sensory experience, the sonic experience falls into that, and I think because there's such a pedestrian score contributing to that side of it, you lose a certain level of connection with the story, especially after Marianne passes away. Adonis realizes sooner than Dame that the fight can't be about violence. It can't be just throwing a punch for the sake of punching. His training teaches him that it's about timing and focus, but he ultimately comes to realize that this time, he's not fighting for the fight. He's fighting to try and reconcile what's happened with what is, and more importantly, what might be in the future. He's seen how Bianca has made peace with her losses, how Marianne made peace with his father, and now he sees Dame fighting the world, going out of his way to hurt it. And Adonis doesn't want that for him. But Adonis's journey is not just about finding a way to finally make amends with Dame, it's also about forgiving himself. He still earned his life. He built what he has, and he can't let his guilt or Dame tear it down. And neither he nor Dame can change the past, hide their respective flaws, but they can rebuild themselves and find new strengths to counteract those flaws. That realization is Adonis's arc in this film. His purpose afterwards is to make Dame see the same light, and he succeeds in the end. It all comes together a little too clean for my liking, a little too quickly and easily after Adonis wins their fight by knockout, but in general, it's a fitting resolution to the story Creed 3 is telling. So, is Creed 3 the weakest of the trilogy? Sure, but it's only because it has Creed and Creed 2 as its competition. Look, for better or worse, for all of the heart these films have, at the end of the day, they are still sports movies. You can only take their conceit so far before they wear thin, and to me, the victory of Creed 3 is that. Even though it strains the central ideas of the Creed films, it never breaks them outright. Yeah, it's a little melodramatic, yeah, it falls into the same pitfalls as the weaker Rocky films as a result, but I do think it sticks the landing and gives us a satisfying resolution to the story of Adonis Creed and his family. So please, no Creed 4. Please, just let it rest. For the love of God, as much as I'm gonna miss Adonis Creed, and in many ways already do, it's the right thing for his story to let him walk away from the ring with his wife and daughter at his side.